Okay, so we're going to go over under kinesiology concepts of muscle contraction. We're going to cover sliding filament theory today, which is the first study point. I think we also need to get into, maybe we also need to get into these other three study points. Let's see, concentric, eccentric. So we've covered some of that. Agonist, antagonist. I don't think we've covered that, so we'll get into that later today. So let's start then. So here's a sample MBLEx question that is an example of not a good question. I just wanted to point this out to you. It's not not essential that we solve the mystery, but I do think that it's good to know what you might be getting into. So what is the name of the connective tissue surrounding the fibers, fasciculi, and bulk of skeletal muscle? Is it fascia, sarcolemma, ligament, or aponeurosis? So if we look at the drawing of the muscle cell that we're familiar with, what we see is, how do I make this smaller? Okay. What we see is that on the outside of the muscle, there's a wrapping, but it's called the epimysium. We don't see fascia. We know there's fascia there. It's just not labeled, right? Almost anything that wraps a muscle or divides muscles is fascia, because the components of fascia, collagen, are also present in many of the other structures, including tendons and ligaments, including the epimysium. There is a difference that the sarcolemma, the epimysium, the perimysium, these are all structures you don't really need to know. All those structures are cell walls, so they have more than just collagenous structure in them. They actually have like fats and carbohydrates. They're a primarily fat layer with carbohydrates and protein structures and all kinds of other stuff. The protein structures form gates. The carbohydrates form part of the like bricks and mortar themselves. And the question for me is a good one just to go over because it's ambiguous. And the reason it's ambiguous is it says, what's the name of the connective tissue surrounding the fibers, fasciculi, and bulk of skeletal muscles? Well, first of all, sarcolemma. A sarcolemma does not surround the bulk of skeletal muscles. A sarcolemma surrounds one single myofibril or muscle cell. Sarcolemma cannot be the answer because it is not connective tissue, strictly speaking. It's similar, but it's not connective tissue. Connective tissue is something that's mostly collagen, elastin, some combination. And it does not surround the bulk of skeletal muscles. It surrounds the fibers. It also does not surround the fasciculi, so it's not that one. Is it a ligament? Well, it can't be a ligament, and it can't be an aponeurosis because a ligament is similar to a tendon. It doesn't surround skeletal muscles. And an aponeurosis, similarly, it wraps the joint. It does not wrap, an aponeurosis doesn't wrap a muscle, it wraps a joint. So that leaves only fascia. However, the problem is that if you look at any of the drawings that are available in like an A&P or a kinesiology reference, you do not see any fascia labeled as wrapping fasciculi or fibers. So down at the smallest level, you don't see fascia. Usually we refer to fascia as the structure, the connective tissue structure that wraps the larger part of the muscle and that divides muscles from each other. So if this is the left gastroc, if this is the medial gastroc and the lateral gastroc are over here, fascia would be between them, dividing them. It would wrap each gastroc and it would also serve to divide the gastrocs. But I don't think I've ever seen it as wrapping fibers and fasciculi. And there's also no study point in the FSMTB e-guide that describes, that assigns to you learning about fascia in this capacity. So as far as I'm concerned, this question is not well worded. If they had said, what's the name of the connective tissue structure surrounding skeletal muscles, that would be fine. It's the smaller parts that are misleading. And the smaller parts, they may point you towards something like the sarcolemma, but the sarcolemma is not connective tissue. It is a cellular structure. So this is an example of how you have to be able to dissect the question. They use specific words like this. This is important, especially for you guys. I mean, for anyone, it's important, but especially for those of us for whom English is a second language, you have to look at the exact words. They're saying, this structure we want you to identify is made of connective tissue. And then you have to think, okay, is fascia made of connective tissue? Is a sarcolemma made of connective tissue? You know, hopefully then the red light goes off for you. I keep muting you guys, and somebody keeps coming unmuted. I'm not blaming anybody, but it's there may be gremlins in the machine. Okay, review of the anatomy or the histology of a muscle cell. So recall that anatomy is like the large and small structures, and that starts to get into histology. Histology is what a cell is made up of. So the histology of a muscle, the anatomy of a muscle cell would be go from a muscle belly, you know, into the muscle fascicles. The muscle fascicles make up the muscle belly. So repeat this with me, right? Muscle belly is made of muscle fascicles. Fascicles are made of muscle fibers or myofibers. Myofibers are made of myofibrils. Myofibrils are made of myofilaments. Myofilaments are made of actin and myosin. And let's go the other way. Actin and myosin, myofilaments, make up myofilaments. Myofilaments make up myofibrils. Myofibrils make up myofibers or muscle fibers. Muscle fibers make up fascicles. Fascicles make up a muscle belly or a muscle. You guys should be drilling that on a regular basis just to memorize it. I actually didn't know that whole sequence until I started teaching MBLEx. Okay, so now the sliding filament theory. So this sliding filament theory has several steps. You do not need, according to the FSMTBE guide, you don't need to know every step, but you do need to know how sliding filament theory works. So the only time they mention sliding filament theory is understand the basic steps that initiate muscle contraction. Example given, sliding filament theory. So what you need to know about sliding filament theory is that a muscle filament, no, not a muscle filament, a filament, a myofilament is made up of actin and myosin. That the myosin is the thick one, the actin is the thin one. Let's see if I can get you a larger picture. There it is. The myosin is thicker, the actin is thinner. Remember, M comes before, M comes after A, so it's the bigger one, or A comes before M, so it's the thinner one. So actin is thin, myosin is thick. And what happens with the actin and myosin filaments is that the myosin has these like little golf heads on it that grab the myosin. The myosin has little golf heads that grab the actin, and they pull the actin from one end to another. So the actin has these little Z-shaped borders called the Z disc. These Z-shaped borders, and the Z-shaped borders actually divide sections of the myofibril. Sections of the myofibril divided by the Z discs, divided by the actin borders, are called sarcomere. So you'll have several sarcomeres stacked end to end like boxcars, and those make up a myofibril. And it gives the myofibril and then the myofiber or the muscle fiber, it gives it its striated appearance, because in some places the actin and myosin overlap even at rest, and in other places it's just the actin alone or just the myosin alone. But the places where the actin and myosin overlap give it a striated appearance, give skeletal muscle a striated appearance. So when the myosin, the thick myosin filaments, when they grab the actin, the thin actin filaments, and they pull the actin along, they're pulling it from this right right half, they're pulling it toward the left, and this left half, they're pulling it toward the right. These two borders come towards each other, and the section between the borders starts to shorten, right? And that gives us muscle fiber shortening. Now, you need a little more than that. So if you look at this this video on YouTube, here's the link. If you look at this video on YouTube, it'd make it pretty clear. So this link takes you to the exact point in the video where you can see that action. I'm sorry that I get stuck sometimes and talk in a weird way. So here we go.
Skeletal muscles are composed of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are long cylindrical cells.
Sorry, it doesn't take you to the exact place. It should, but it doesn't. Okay, so let's go here, just so we have some context. Let me grab that new link so I can replace that.
And slide past each other. The thick filaments are myosin, which are anchored at
Myosin is the thick filament. Actin is the thin filament. Actin filaments join with each other at what's called the Z disc. They form this Z-shaped border.
Center of the sarcomere, called the M line.
I do not believe that you need to know M line, H zone, I bands. I don't think you need to know those.
The thin filaments are composed of the protein actin, which are anchored to the Z lines on the outer edges of the sarcomere. Because the actin filaments are anchored to the Z lines, the sarcomere shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments.
Yeah, so that explains it pretty good.
Shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments.
Yeah.
Shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments. Although the action between the filaments is described as sliding, the myosin filament actually pulls the actin along its length. The cross bridges of the myosin filaments attach to the actin filaments and exert force on them to move. This action is known as the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. In this,
you don't need to know stroke or sliding filament mechanism. You don't need to know any of that highly specialized terminology, I believe. So please speak up if you want to see that again. Let's go replace that link. So that is sliding filament theory.
I would love to see it all day. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. You can continue.
Okay. Thank you, Sandra. All right. So now let's save agonist, antagonist, synergist. Let's save the kinesthetic portion or the movement portion for later. But we're going to do the lecture portion, the didactic portion now. So let's go over isometric, concentric, eccentric, and isotonic. So if you break these words down, you get iso and metric, right? And iso means same or no change. Metric means length, or how to measure something. So isometric means the length is staying the same. And if you look at an isometric movement is one in which the joint and the muscle is not moving. Oftentimes they'll have you place a limb or the bone that the muscle moves. They'll have you place that against something immovable. So one of the common MBLEx questions is about the infraspinatus muscle that does external rotation, right? And they want to know, is it isometric, is it concentric, eccentric, or isotonic? And they describe it as the client's arm is by their side, the elbow is bent at 90 degrees, and the forearm is against something immovable. I'm just going to use my hand, but the forearm is against something like a wall, and they're pressing the forearm into the wall. So you're supposed to know first that what this position looks like. Arm by the hand, elbow bent at 90 degrees, forearm pressing into an immovable object. So if the arm is in this position, the only way to press the forearm is to externally rotate. So you have to know first that this is external rotation they're talking about, right? Then you got to know second what muscle does external rotation. Primarily, it's the infraspinatus. And the third thing you have to know is that since there's no movement, since the bones are not moving, the muscle is not actually shortening. It's an isometric. There's no change in the length. Just going to open this window because it's pretty hot in here. However, it's also important to understand why isometrics are useful for us, and that is because if someone has an acute injury, if someone has like a stage 1 injury that's, you know, they've acquired in the last few weeks, you don't really need to know that, but if someone has an acute injury, okay, an acute injury, you don't really want to go like moving it. You don't want to lengthen and shorten the muscle. You don't want to move the joint, especially if you, in real life, if you don't understand exactly what structures in there are compromised. It's best to get the person to have an MRI or at least see a doctor or a really good physical therapist who says, okay, I'm pretty sure that it's this ligament or this muscle or this joint that's compromised, right? So you wouldn't do let's say I have a wrist injury, right? You wouldn't do movements like this, which move the wrist joint during an acute injury, because there could be something torn, like a ligament, a retinaculum, or a tendon, or a joint capsule, or there may be something broken. And you don't want to move bones that may be broken. You don't want to lengthen and shorten tendons and ligaments that may be torn, right? That's only going to make it worse. But you do want to work the muscles because you don't want them to atrophy, and you want them to be slightly contracting, not shortening, not lengthening and shortening, because what if the muscle is torn, right? What if the tendon attached to the muscle is torn? And if you have them shorten the muscle and pull on the ligament, then those two the tendon, then those two structures could also be torn a little bit more. So hopefully now you guys understand why movement is not the best option. Shortening the muscle and moving the joint is not the best option during acute injury. But if you do an isometric, like if you put like a splint around this hand, or you just hold the hand or give it some resistance, and then you say, okay, extend your wrist. See, the wrist is doing this movement, but I'm not actually moving. So now I'm actually waking up my wrist extensors, putting a little stress on the muscles, but they're not actually shortening. These muscles are not actually shortening. So there's no danger that it's going to tear, that anything's going to tear. And I'm also not moving the joint. And then go this way. Okay, now do wrist flexion, right? Again, the muscles are being worked. The blood is being forced to come through in greater amounts. The muscle is starting to play a role in warming the place up. So there's better circulation. There's a little bit of stress. The muscle fibers are being activated, which helps to keep them from atrophying, right? And the person gets to work actively on their healing, which has a profound psychological impact. So all those things are good, but in the first stage of injury, there's no movement with an isometric in the wrist and no shortening or lengthening of the muscle fibers in an isometric. So that's one reason isometrics are good. Another reason, and you definitely should know that for the MBLEx. Another reason isometrics are good, just as a side note, not related to the MBLEx at all, is that isometrics actually recruit more muscle fibers than concentrics or eccentrics. So if you do an isometric and hold it for 30 seconds, close to 100% of the muscle fibers are being woken up. And a big problem that we have in injuries and chronic pain is that the muscles are kind of asleep. They're inactive. They're down regulated, a percentage of them is not being used. You can have stiffness and muscles that are tight, but they're also inactive. And we often don't think about that component. People aren't getting enough movement. They're not getting enough of the right kind of stress. It's important to do the movements that we do in everyday life. I'm going to get a little real with you for a minute, okay? So things that we do that we have to do, like sitting down onto the toilet and getting up off the toilet, hip hinging in order to, do basic hygiene after the toilet. Those are the squat and the deadlift. But how many people do you know who squat and deadlift regularly? And you don't have to do it with weight. You can just do body weight. Mike Tyson did 500 squats as his warm up before every training session. Of course, he was 18 and, you know, a prodigy, an exceptional person. But, you know, doing them just with your body weight has tremendous merit. So high level, if it's good enough for high level athletes to activate their bodies, it's definitely good enough for us. All right, and then getting dressed, you know, putting your shirt on, stuff like that. Those all involve some aspect of side bending and rotation. They involve flexion or abduction of the shoulder. Like all those things should be done on a regular basis. So do a little bit of yoga, do some deadlifting and hip hinging and squatting movements. They're beyond good for you. They're necessary for everything we do: carrying groceries, keeping up with our kids, going to the toilet, getting in and out of the bathtub. You know, putting your AC in, gardening. These are the things where people get hurt, and the things people can't do when they get hurt. So isotonic means that a muscle changes its length, and isometric means a muscle does not change its length. So types of isotonics are concentric and eccentric. And I'm just going to move this up here. Types of isotonics are concentric and eccentric, and you probably are aware that concentric means shortening and eccentric means lengthening. So con, literally, if we break the words down, con literally means oh yeah, by the way, let me go back to isometric and isotonic. So isometric means the shape doesn't change, the length doesn't change. Isotonic means the resistance doesn't change. So throughout the whole movement of the joint, of the use of the muscle, the weight stays the same. So you pick up a 10-pound dumbbell and do a curl or do a press. Throughout that whole movement, the weight does not change. That's an isotonic. Compared to something where maybe you have like a stretchy band in your hand, for example, and then you do this. Well, at the first pull, the weight will be, you know, X pounds. And about 90 degrees, it'll be 2 times X pounds. At, you know, 135 degrees, it'll be 3 times X pounds. So you may start with 1 pound in your hand and you end by pulling 3 pounds because the band is becoming more taut. So that, strictly speaking, is not an isotonic type of movement. The muscles are contracting with a concentric type of contraction, but the movement itself is not isotonic. There's some kind of other name for that you don't need to know. But the reason it's called isotonic is because sometimes the force, the resistance stays the same, and sometimes it doesn't. So types of isotonic movements are concentric and eccentric. Con means with or same. And then ECC means against. So when I think of concentric, I think of muscle fibers. If you have a muscle and the fibers are going this way, I think of muscle fibers going with the direction that they're designed to go. So my 2 wrists are the ends of the muscles, or the Z discs in the myofilaments. The 2 ends are being drawn towards each other. The muscle fibers are sliding past each other. They're going with concentric direction. And then when you're, you know, lowering the weight down or extending the joint or whatever, you open up the joint and the muscle fibers start to move away from each other. The muscle fibers start to slide away from each other, and the 2 Z discs, the 2 ends, start to move away from each other. And that is ec, or eccentric, right? Ec, or eccentric. So we're going to look at concentric and eccentric in specific contexts later when we practice, and we probably will practice those multiple times. If you squat as you're going down, the weight is moving towards the floor, your body is starting to fold up. That is eccentric. The muscle fibers are starting to lengthen. So if you look at the hip, when you start the movement, the hip is straight. The torso is upright and the legs are right down below the torso, straight line from the torso through the hip down through the legs. As you lower your body down in the squat, hopefully you can see that the hip starts to flex. The leg comes towards a 90-degree angle or more. And what that does to the glutes is it lengthens them, right? It sort of stretches them. And if you push away from the floor and stand up, that contracts or shortens the glute fibers as the hip angle starts to go from 90 degrees back towards 180 degrees, where the leg is right below the torso. So the term for these muscle fibers lengthening as they are bearing weight, as they are exerting force, is eccentric. The glute max, also the hamstrings, the biceps femoris, the semis, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, hamstrings, gastrocs and soleus, those are all contracting eccentrically. Lots of times when we picture movement or exercise, especially things where we're moving lots of weight or where there's a lot of force involved, we think of contraction as only muscle shortening, but muscles can contract while lengthening as well. Think of contraction as being the movement of actin and myosin filaments sliding past each other. They can slide in a way that shortens them. They can slide in a way that lengthens them. So lengthening allows us to control and handle weight just in a different way because the muscle fibers are moving away from each other, eccentric, lengthening. Then when you push up, as the hip starts to straighten, the leg comes into a straight position relative to the torso. Hopefully you can imagine that the muscle fibers in the glute and the hamstrings, they would start to contract, right? They would start to contract concentrically. They would start to shorten. So we're going to practice later today. You'll see me do a squat and then stand up, or hip hinge and then straighten up, and I'll point to my glute and I'll be like, okay, is this shortening or lengthening? Is shortening concentric or eccentric, right? Is it the agonist or the antagonist? And that's a useful exercise, easy and useful exercise to practice. I don't mean easy like you're going to get it right all the time. I mean like it's useful. Okay, if we look at moving the neck in various ways, so this is flexion, bringing the chin toward the chest, and this is extension, bringing the chin up to the ceiling. So in flexion, the front surface, the neck flexors are shortening, and in extension, the neck flexors are lengthening and the extensors are shortening. In flexion, the neck flexors, the muscles in the front, they are contracting concentrically, and the extensors in the back, which are lengthening, they're contracting eccentrically. In the opposite direction, when you extend the neck flexors are lengthening. That means that they're contracting eccentrically, and the extensors in the back are contracting concentrically because they're shortening. There's also broadly speaking, for movement, there's concentric and eccentric movements. If we break the body down into smaller parts, we can see that some parts are actually moving eccentrically and some are moving concentrically. But if you think about one muscle at a time, it becomes pretty clear. Okay, so for example, here's a push-up. So this person is going from the plank position to chest to floor, right? So elbows bent, shoulders extended. Remember shoulder flexion and extension look like this. So this is flexion, right? And this is neutral, and this is extension, right? So if I'm going from here to here, look how my humerus is moving. Don't look from my elbow to my hand. Look how my humerus is moving, right? I'm moving into shoulder extension. All right. So you have shoulder extension in the bottom one, and then you have elbow flexion, and then you have the shoulder blades coming together. So if you look at this arrow, it says eccentric from plank to chest to floor. That's because the nature of that movement is eccentric. The main movers that are allowing us to lower ourselves down without smacking our body into the floor are the pectoralis major and then the triceps muscle. And the triceps, because the triceps extend the elbow, the elbow is being flexed, so the triceps are being lengthened, right? The triceps are being lengthened, so that's an eccentric contraction. The pectoralis major, they push the arms away. They push the arms away and they bring the shoulder into flexion. but we're going this way. We're bringing the hands towards us and the shoulders moving into extension. So the pectoralis major muscles are lengthening. That's eccentric. But if you look at other parts of the body, like the rhomboids are coming together. As you start to lower yourself down, your shoulder blades retract. Not everybody does that way, but most people will do some retraction. The shoulder blades start to retract, and that shoulder blade retraction means shortening in between the shoulder blades of the rhomboids. That means a concentric contraction of the rhomboids. The whole time that you're doing a push-up, you should be squeezing your butt muscles and your leg muscles. So your glutes and your hamstrings are shortening, and that also is concentric throughout the entire movement. So one thing that I often confuse is the phase of the movement itself. This is the eccentric phase of a push-up, and this is the concentric phase of a push-up, going from the floor into the plank. Pushing up is concentric, lowering down is eccentric. But within that movement, relative to like the different sides of the body, the front, the back, there's some eccentric contractions and some concentric contractions. The phase and the contractions are different. So we did all these. Now, have we gone over muscles in the different parts of the body? I don't think that we went over the muscles in the back surface. Okay. We're going to go over the muscles in the back surface another time. That's kind of a lot. We introduced like the splenius muscles, the iliocostalis, the longissimus muscles. We introduced all those. If you want to get a jump on that, if you want to get a jump and start reviewing that, you go to your MBLEx folder and go down to kinesiology. Is this right? It might be in muscles. Hold on a second. Or is it an ENP? Then a minute to populate. Sorry, guys, I do want to find this for the record. Because this slide is something that I want you to review multiple times. This presentation is something I want you to review multiple times. So this should look familiar to you. We did this. Okay, so here we get started with the muscles on the back surface of the body. Iliocostalis lumborum, spinalis muscles, spinal erectors, spinalis, splenius. I'm just throwing stuff out there randomly, that I'm reading stuff randomly. So this is in MBLEx, and this is kinesio-proprioception, components and characteristics of muscles. And I think we may, I do need to do some housekeeping and clean these things up. Do want to acknowledge that this is not all organized the way it should be. It looks like I have successfully moved the muscles out of the body systems, the old body systems drive. But if you guys can take a look at that kinesiology at kinesiology proprioception, components and characteristics of muscles, that'll get you started with what muscles are on the back surface of the body. That lecture is incomplete. I do need to flesh out a little bit more of like what's in the front of the neck, the side of the neck, and what muscles are in other parts of the body. Usually I just pull those up and show them to you as we go along, but it'd be good for you to have some kind of like solid reference where you can see stuff. Okay, so where should we pick up? That one, that one. Should we go over these now? No, let's not go over these now. So we're going to go over the maybe we should go over them now. Yeah. What the heck? Let's just do the muscles of the neck and the back surface now. I mean, it is important, so here we go. So you guys remember this kinesio-proprioception, components and characteristics of muscles. This included all the information on Golgi tendon organs and muscle spindle fibers. You guys remember sensory afferent muscle spindle fibers. intrafusal muscle spindle fibers. We can review that if anybody feels they need to. And it also includes information on the myofibers and myofilaments. So, and down at the bottom, we have the layers of the muscles on the back surface. So if you go to most of these slides, they have like links in them. And if you click on any of the links, it'll open up the source from which I took this. This is KenHub, and it's a really great resource. We're going to look at it a little more closely in a minute. So the muscles that you need to know for the back surface, for like the whole back surface of the body, not including the glutes. So I'm stopping before the glutes and the piriformis, so before anything that's in the butt, for everything from the low back up to the base of the skull. Those muscles that you need to know are the splenius muscles. Going to give you a quick summary, and then we'll go over them one by one. The splenius muscles, which are in the neck, and then you need to know the erector spinae muscles, iliocostalis longissimus, and spinalis muscles, right? And so they look like, it's on the end of that slide. Okay, so they look like this. So you have the spinal erector group, which is also called the iliocostalis longissimus and spinalis group, and KenHub has a nice breakdown. So if you go to the erector spinae muscles, you see this picture here, which is in our presentation, the first one there, right? It's the erector spinae group. It's important to go through this because you have to understand how it's organized. And then down below, you see the erector spinae are divided into three groups, from medial to lateral, and that is the spinalis, longissimus, and the iliocostalis. If you can remember ILS, I like sex. Most of us find that funny enough to remember it, I like sex. Otherwise, you'll never remember iliocostalis or longissimus or spinalis. And if we break each one of these down, we see their specific function. So we have the spinalis muscles. I'm going to go back to the presentation now. So you have the spinalis group, and you have the longissimus group, and then you have the iliocostalis group. So the purpose of each of these groups, even though they look a little bit different, some of their functions are slightly different. Purpose of each of these groups is to extend the extend the body, extend the spine. When you think about muscles, think about what side of the body they're on. Muscles that are on the front, they flex the body. Muscles that are on the back, they extend the body. Muscles that are on the side, they abduct. Muscles that are on the inside of the body, they adduct or internally rotate. So a lot can be discerned or figured out just by thinking about what side the muscles are on. And I'll coach you on that later for eccentric, concentric. They have some other like finer specific roles, like most of them, because they're on the right side of the body and then the left side of the body. If you contract one side at a time, most of them will side flex. And the term you want to remember is same side or ipsilateral. So I haven't seen ipsilateral and contralateral used much on MBLEx, but same side is ipsilateral, which is the opposite of contralateral. Contralateral means opposite side. So if you wanted to I wanted to take my left hand and reach down to the floor and pick up a pencil, I would be side bending. So that would be contraction on the left side of the erector spinae muscles. It would be my spinalis group, my longissimus group, and my iliocostalis group on the left side of my spine that are shortening concentrically. And the muscles on the other side would be lengthening. They'd be contracting eccentrically. But the question is going to come to you like, which muscle does lateral flexion or side bending on the same side? And it would be one of these choices. It'd be these muscles, because when they contract on the left, you side bend to the left. When you contract them on the right, you side bend to the right. They also will do some torsion usually to the same side. Torsion usually happens on the same side. Okay, so let's look at the names because it'll help you remember them a little more clearly. Splenius, you can just, splenius capitis and splenius cervicis, you can just refer to these as splenius or spleni. Splenius means flat. That's like a pretty foreign word to most of us, but splenius means flat. So these are the flat muscles. And you can remember capitis like capo, like in the mafia, or like baseball cap, or like da capo in music, back to the head. It means head. So splenius capitis is the thin muscle that attaches to the skull, attaches to the head. It does bilaterally, like all of them. If you contract both sides, it does extension. So does the splenius cervicis, which attaches to the cervical spine, cervicis, cervical spine, capitis, cap, or head. Both of them do extension. Both of them, when you contract just one side, will do lateral flexion to that side. The splenius capitis, you can see because it attaches to the skull, also does some torsion to the same side. But I think of all the movement functions, torsion is probably the one that you can pay the least attention to. I think the chances of them asking you about torsion alone is pretty slim. Think about it. If you know a muscle, where a muscle is, and you don't know the function that it does the majority of the time, or that most of its strength is dedicated to, then you don't know that muscle. But if you miss like a percentage of a movement that's done by a smaller percentage of the muscle fibers, or that's not done most of the time, that's, you still can know a lot about that muscle. All right. Splenius muscles. That's the splenius capitis, splenius cervicis. Capitis for head, cervicis for cervical spine. Splenius means thin. So the splenius muscles. So if they say what muscles among these choices can do neck extension, the splenius muscles would be some of the muscles you would look for in the choices. Any confusion about that before we move on? All right, and then the erector spinae muscles. Reminder, the erector spinae muscles are the eye-like sex muscles. The erector spinae muscles are also called the SEGs, the spinal erector group. Spinal erector group, right? So the erector spinae muscles include the iliocostalis, the longissimus, and the spinalis. I have summaries in different formats. Here I have them listed in bullet points on this slide. On this slide, I have them showing. So if you look at them, it looks like, oh my God, so much information. How am I going to do this? Iliocostalis, and there's 3 of them, and altogether there's 9 of them. Well, if you look at each of them, first of all, let's start with the big picture. So the names tell you something about the muscle. So the ilio means ilium. Ilium because the muscle attaches down at the ilium. And then costalis means ribs. So the muscles attach at the ribs. And I think if we look at the iliocostalis individually, well, so here's the iliocostalis group. I think we'll find that some muscle fibers, it's a little bit too fine, you can't see, but just take my word for it. Some muscle fibers start in the ribs and they go up to the cervicals. And some fibers start at the ilium and they go up to the ribs, the costals. So you have some ilio originating and some costal originating, some costal inserting and some cervical inserting, but taken all together, they have an appropriately named iliocostalis. If you look at the longissimus muscles, the longissimus are named because they are the longest. They go from the sacrum all the way up to the cap. They're the longest. Spinalis, I think they're named because they're the closest to the spine. And if that's not the reason that they're named, it's a fine name for them. All right, and then you look at how they're broken down. Well, the iliocostalis muscles have cervicis, that's a cervical part. So they attach in the cervical part. They attach in a cervical part right here, cervical. They have a thoracis. They attach in the thoracic region. So the costals or the ribs attach in the thoracic region. Right. So there's a thoracic section, and then there's a lumbar vertebrae section. So there's cervicis, thoracis, and lumborum for the iliocostalis muscles. They are not going to ask you, I'm guessing, but they're not going to ask you to differentiate between the iliocostalis cervicis and the iliocostalis thoracis or iliocostalis lumborum. And I would bet your money back, if I could, that they are not going to mix these things up in an attempt to confuse you. Like, they're not going to call, see, this is longissimus capitis. They're not going to call iliocostalis cervicis iliocostalis capitis, and then another choice be iliocostalis cervicis. I don't think they're going to do that to you. So it's enough for you just to be familiar and not have these three sections of each of the spinal erector group, erector spinae group, Ilex group, familiar and not solid. That's fine. So the longissimus muscles, they have the capitis, the cervicis, and the thoracis. Dominique.
Yes, sir.
What does capitis stand for? Capitis, like cap or capo.
The part of your head.
The head, yeah. It's well, I don't think it's technically, I don't think it's the back of the head, but if you want to think of it as the back of the head, that's fine, as long as you think head, skull, cranium. Yeah.
Correct.
So for the longissimus capitis, where would you expect to see attachments? The one place you would definitely expect to see attachments for the longissimus capitis would be at the head, correct?
Right.
Yeah. And then for the longissimus cervicis, the one place you would expect to definitely see attachments would be where? Cervicis means what?
The neck area?
Yes, exactly, because it refers to what part of the spine? What's a word for those vertebrae? Lumbar, thoracic, or Dominique, look at the word when you're sitting for the exam. You got to look at the words and remember and practice your word breakdowns. So that part of the neck is called cervical spine. Exactly.
Cervical.
Exactly. Thank you, Dom. Yes. Thank you, Dom. Thank you, Dominique. Emmy, are you with us?
Yes.
Hi, Emmy.
Hi.
So the longissimus thoracis, where would you expect to see attachments for the longissimus thoracis?
The thoracic or
The thoracic spine.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right. That's right. That's right. Spinalis capitis and spinalis cervicis. Spinalis capitis and spinalis cervicis. What's the difference between the attachments of the spinalis capitis and the spinalis cervicis? What's the difference?
one's on the head and one's on the cervix.
That's
Cervical.
right. Which one is on the head? Yes. Which one is on the head?
capitis.
The capitis. That's right. Very good, Emmy. Very good, Emmy. Good. Okay. And then Sandra.
Yes, sir.
Sandra, which one attaches to the head, the splenius capitis or the splenius cervicis?
Splenius capitis.
Correct. And if you're contracting both sides, the left and the right, bilateral contraction, what movement does the splenius capitis do? Neck extension, neck rotation, or neck side flexion?
Side flexion.
If you contract bilaterally both sides at the same time, extension, side flexion, or rotation?
Rotation.
Okay, Sandra, third time's a charm, right? Third time's a charm. So both sides contracting bilaterally, would the neck extend or would it side flex or rotate?
Okay, then it's rotation.
Oh, Sandra,
Oh my goodness.
Sandra, you know, I really do like you. If I didn't like you, I would just ignore you. So imagine that you're bringing this skull backward. Don't be sorry. Imagine you're bringing this skull backward, the nose up to the ceiling. Okay, you are extending the neck, extending the neck. Go back to anatomically correct. This is anatomically correct, seeing it from the front. So down like this is flexion, up like this is extension. Can you visualize or even feel in your own body? Can you visualize or feel how in order to extend the neck, you have to use both sides of the neck muscles?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Extension.
And then yes. And then can you side flex and imagine or feel how that uses only one side of the neck?
Correct.
Yes. So if a question says, what movement is accomplished through the bilateral contraction, it means both sides, either side of the spine, the muscles on both sides of the spine. The answer
Okay.
must be extension.
Extension.
Yes.
Got it. Clear. You can ask it again.
Good.
Sorry.
Okay. All right. You ready?
Thank you. Yes.
So bilateral contraction of the splenius capitis muscle gives us which movement? Extension, side flexion, or rotation?
Extension.
And unilateral
bilateral.
contraction of the splenius capitis would give us which movement? Extension, flexion, or side flexion?
Side flexion.
Very good. Very good. Let's take a break. It's 12:14. Unless there are any questions, let's take a 10-minute break and come back at 12:24, ready to do some movement. Okay, see you guys at 12:24. Come back at 12:24.
Yes, sir.
Recording. Okay, so did a spotlight? No, it doesn't matter. Hit. There we go. Good. Okay, guys, so let's get oriented. Remember that anatomically correct is always this way. Yeah. So you're looking at the anterior surface of the body, and behind you is the posterior surface of the body. This would be the anterior portion of the hand, also called palmar or volar, V-O-L-A-R. And then the back surface would be the dorsal portion. So we have anterior, also called ventral, and then we have posterior, also called dorsal. And then for the palm, we have volar or palmar. Back is also called dorsal. Remember, there's special terms for the foot. So for the foot, the bottom of the foot is not called ventral or anterior. It's called plantar. And the top of the foot is called dorsal or dorsum. Just like this is the dorsal surface. All right, and then we have distal. Let's do medial and lateral next. So medial refers towards the midline. Medial is towards the midline. The midline is here, right? So the nose is more medial than the ears, and the ears are more lateral than the nose. The eyes are more medial, more toward the midline than the ears. The shoulders are lateral. The sternum is medial. If we're talking about like, let's see, medial and lateral, which muscles are medial and lateral? So a lot of the muscles in the back that we see are listed as being more medial or lateral. So for example, the spinalis group is right next to the spine. Those are very medial, and the longissimus are further out, and those are much more lateral than the spinalis group. The ribs are lateral. The spine is more medial. That also works on the lower body. So you have the lateral aspect of the leg, like the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis. You also have aspects of bones, like both on the femur and on the humerus. You have, for example, the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. The radius is lateral, the ulna is medial. And let's go to distal and proximal. So this is medial, this is lateral, this is distal, and this is proximal, right? So the shoulder is proximal relative to the elbow. Proximal, by the way, means towards the center of the body. This is the center of the body, okay? So you have distal and you have proximal. So proximal, the shoulder is more proximal than the elbow. The elbow, however, is more proximal than the wrist. The wrist is more proximal than the fingertips. The fingertips are the most distal of all the structures. So distal is going this way, proximal is going this way. In the lower body, you have the exact same configuration. So the hip is more proximal, the knee is more distal. Distal is towards the foot, right? And then proximal is up toward the center of the body. What else did we do? So for fingers and for fingers and for toes, the fingers and for toes, there are 3 digits, 1, 2, 3, except in the thumb and the great toe or the big toe, which are both called hallux or halices, and those have only 2, right? Well, I guess I could do this anyway. So there's a proximal bone and a distal bone. That's called the phalange, the proximal phalange, distal phalange. Proximal phalange, distal phalange for the digit, and the intermediate. So proximal, intermediate, and distal. Anterior superior, ventral dorsal, superior, inferior. I think you guys have that, superior and inferior. The hand only has volar and dorsal. Palmar, also called palmar for volar. That's better. Guys, I'm still learning how to use this camera. It's a lot smart. It's a lot more complicated than I am. Foot plantar and dorsal, and now we're on to planes. So remember that we have coronal or frontal, right? And then we have sagittal, and then we have transverse. So coronal, I like to remember that because it contains abduction and adduction. If you continue to abduct, you arrive at the corona, which is the top of the head, right? So this is frontal or coronal, and it contains abduction and adduction. That's for the shoulder and arm, as well as abduction for the leg, adduction for the leg, right? And then there's also side flexion of the neck, and then side flexion of the spine, and a little bit of movement through the hip joint for side flexion. Let me just do this. Yeah, let's move it. Okay, so that's the frontal plane, right? And then you have the sagittal plane. If you can just remember sagittal, you'll be fine. Don't worry about mid-sagittal versus parasagittal, right? So technically the arm is moving in a parasagittal plane and the spine permits movement in the mid-sagittal plane. But if you can just remember sagittal, that's good enough. So sagittal includes flexion of the shoulder, extension of the shoulder, right? Flexion and extension of the shoulder, flexion of the hip, extension of the hip. Also, it'd be flexion of the knee, plantar flexion, dorsal flexion of the ankle, extension of the knee. It'd be flexion and extension of the elbow, flexion and extension of the wrist and the fingers, and then flexion and extension of the spine and the hip joints, right? So you can have flexion and extension of the hip this way, or you can have flexion and extension of the hip this way. One is with the foot off on the floor, one is with the foot off. And also flexion and extension of the neck. So flexion, extension of the neck, flexion, extension of the spine, flexion, extension of the, everything else. All right, and then we have horizontal or transverse plane. Horizontal or transverse plane contains horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. It also contains rotation of the neck, rotation of the spine. Yeah, and I think that's it. Oh, some finer movements. So the movements of the wrist. This is called ulnar deviation and radial deviation, and they're occurring within this plane, which is the frontal or the coronal plane. So ulnar and radial deviation from anatomically correct are happening within the frontal plane, right? If you do them this way, this is happening through the sagittal plane. But from anatomically correct, they happen this way. And then joint movement. So we've done a lot of flexion and extension, abduction, adduction. Let's do some of the finer ones. So we have supination, and then we have pronation. So supination, like carrying a bowl of soup, and then pronation, like prone to spilling it, right? Supination, pronation. Also for the foot, we have supination this way. For the foot, we have supination this way, and then pronation this way. I like to think of the big toe, the great toe, as pressing down for pronation and then coming up for supination, and then pronation. Plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, we did that one already. And then we have protraction, retraction, elevation, and depression. So protraction is shoulder blades apart. Retraction is shoulder blades together, right? So that's kind of like a push-up movement. Protraction is shoulder blades apart. Retraction is shoulder blades together. Elevation is shoulder blades up. Depression is shoulder blades down. Shoulder blades up is the upper traps for elevation. Shoulder blades down is the latissimus dorsi for elevation. Protraction is the anterior serratus and the latissimus dorsi. Retraction is the rhomboids and the middle trapezius. We should go over those more thoroughly soon. Inversion and eversion. Is there inversion here? No, there's no inversion here. Inversion and eversion happens at the foot. There are three movements with each of those. So for so inversion looks like this, and eversion looks like that. Inversion is the typical way that we roll our ankle. Let me put this down. Put this down so it's something that's a little bit more like a floor thing. All right, so for the foot, for the foot, you have inversion and then eversion. So inversion is the way we usually sprain our ankle. If I mess around, I actually will do that to my ankle. So please don't do that to your ankle. So inversion actually has three movements. The first is supination, right? Supination, pronation. So it has supination. Inversion also has a little bit of adduction. See how my toe is pointing toward the midline? So there's a little of this movement happening, right? So it's this movement and supination. And there's also a little bit of, let's see. There's also a little bit of plantar flexion. So plantar flexion, adduction, and then supination is considered the full movement of inversion, like this, right? And then for eversion, it goes the other way. For eversion, it's abduction, and then pronation, and then pronation this way, abduction that way, and then dorsiflexion. So dorsiflexion, pronation, abduction is eversion. So it looks like this. They will ask you to break those down for sure. Dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, wrist deviation, abduction, adduction. So wrist deviation, radial deviation towards the radius. The thumb radiates outward in an anatomically correct position. Wrist deviation, radial deviation, ulnar deviation, radial deviation, ulnar deviation. I also have seen it in practice questions as adduction. Abduction. You're adding toward the midline. You're abducting away from the midline, but really it's ulnar and radial deviation. Let's see what else we got. I think that's going to be it. Lateral flexion, horizontal, diagonal, circumduction. Circumduction can happen at the ankle. That's where the distal end, so this is the toe. That's where the distal end makes a big circle, and the part that joins the rest of the body, the ankle, makes a point or a smaller circle, right? So circumduction at the ankle, right? And then circumduction at the hip. So now the whole leg is making that that big circle, the toe is making that big circle, and the hip is the point making a small circle. Yes, Dominique, we all need to practice. Yes. Work it out. And then sorry, I got my cords wrapped up. Give me a second here. Anybody watching this on YouTube? Yes, this is typical for my videos. Okay, and then circumduction at the shoulder, right? So the finger is making the large movement, the shoulder is making the big movement. It's shaped like a cone or a Christmas tree, right? And then you can also have circumduction at the head, and then lateral flexion also called side flexion, lateral flexion through the spine, or side flexion, extension, and flexion. We all want to remember that. Extension, Sandra, and flexion. All right. Now, we're going to get into some good stuff. All right. So let's start with with an area of the body that's relatively simple, which is the front versus the back surface of the body. All right. So we're going to do shortening versus lengthening, concentric versus eccentric of the flexors versus the extensors. So if you have the neck, if we're talking about the neck, you have the flexors in the front and you have the extensors in the back. Okay, so everybody unmute and just call out, right? So if I am lowering my head down, is this front surface shortening or lengthening? Everybody unmute.
Shortening.
Shortening. And is the back surface shortening or lengthening?
Lengthening.
That's right. Lengthening. The back surface is lengthening. All right. Another way of saying it, if I tilt my head back, if I'm in neck extension, which surface is shortening?
The back.
The back, yeah.
The back surface. And which surface is lengthening?
The neck.
The front surface. The front surface. That's right. That's right. The neck surface. Very good. So if we are extending and the back is shortening, is that con or E? Concentric or eccentric? Con. Very good.
Concentric.
Shortening is concentric, and the front, which is lengthening, must then be
Eccentric.
eccentric. Very good. If I flex my neck, if I lower my chin down, which surface is shortening? Front or back? Which surface is shortening? The front. The front. Is that the agonist or the antagonist?
Antagonist.
The antagonist shortens. I'm sorry. The agonist shortens, the antagonist lengthens. So again, the front, is that shortening or lengthening?
Short.
Shortening. And is that the agonist or antagonist?
Agonist.
Yes. And the back is lengthening, which makes it what? The agonist or antagonist?
Antagonist.
Antagonist. That's right. Which one is the prime mover always? The agonist or the antagonist?
Antagonist.
The agonist. The agonist is always the prime mover. The one that's shortening is always the prime mover. Okay, if I'm doing side flexion, which side is shortening? The right or the left? Which side is shortening? The right or the left?
The right. Right.
The right one. Does that mean the agonist muscles are on the right or the left?
The right.
The right. Where are the prime movers, the right or the left?
Right. Right.
Very good. And if the agonist shortening concentric prime movers are on the right, where is the antagonist eccentric movers, on the right or the left?
The left.
Very good. Very good. Okay, now the abdominals and the SEGs, also called the I love sex, also called the spinal erector group. So if we're flexing, if I'm doing a crunch, I'm flexing my spine. Which side is shortening, the front or the back?
The front.
The front. Does that make which muscles are in the front? Abdominals. So are the abdominals, the abdominals are shortening. Does that mean they're concentric contracting or eccentric contracting?
Concentric.
Concentric contracting, shortening, agonist, concentric, prime mover. And which ones are performing eccentric contraction? Which muscles?
Longissimus.
You could say longissimus. That's the letter L from I Love Sex, which is the same as the spinal erector group, which is the same as the erector spinae group. Yes, or you could say the muscles in the back, or you could say the erectors. That would be fine. Longissimus is one of three. You would still get the right idea, but it's a little more specific. Saying longissimus is, I think, a little bit too specific. It's better to zoom out and say spinal erector group or erectors. Or in our class, I like sex muscles. Don't go saying I like sex. You know, what is this? I like sex. Okay, yeah, I mean, I know it's ridiculous, but anyway. Okay, and then the other way, extension, right? So extension means which surface is shortening, the front or the back?
The back.
The back surface is shortening. That's right. So if the back surface is shortening, which muscles are contracting concentrically? Which group?
The
The back muscles. The erectors, yes, also called
Erector spinae.
I know.
erector spinae are part of them, yes. And in our group only, they're called the I
Like sex.
like sex muscles, the
Ilio.
yes, fill in the blank, what? Rib, iliocostalis is the I part, the like is longissimus, very good. And then the S part is splenius, erector spinae, shucks. Spinalis, I'm sorry, spinalis muscles, yes, spinalis or spinalis muscles, yeah. Spinalis, longissimus, and iliocostalis.
Oh my gosh.
Spinal erector group or erectors, yes. Okay, and then let's move on to shoulder flexion. So we have the anterior deltoid and the posterior deltoid. Okay, where's the concentric contraction right now in shoulder flexion? Is it in the anterior deltoid or posterior deltoid?
Posterior. Or no.
Okay,
Is it the
good
anterior?
catch. Very good, very good. Jessica, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, very good, Jessica. So the anterior, good catch. So the anterior deltoid fibers are shortening. They're the ones that perform arm flexion or shoulder flexion. And then the posterior fibers, the posterior deltoid muscles are lengthening. So they would be contracting in what way? Concentric or eccentric?
Eccentric.
Eccentric.
Eccentric, that's correct.
Yeah.
Why concentric, Sandra?
Because it was moving up, so it's very concentrated. Sorry, but
Okay, you said, okay, but you're using ambiguous pronouns. You're saying it was moving up, so it was concentric. I'd like you to use flexion versus extension, anterior versus posterior. So the arm is moving into flexion, which means what, Sandra? For eccentric and concentric.
agonist.
What agonist, anterior or posterior?
Anterior.
Anterior is the agonist. And what is the nature of the contraction in the anterior deltoid muscle in shoulder flexion? Is it concentric or eccentric?
Eccentric.
Concentric, that's correct. And is it called the prime mover?
Yes.
Good job, Sandra. Sandra, the prime mover is always the agonist. The agonist is always the prime mover. Okay,
I'm
now
so
shoulder.
Sorry, my son
That's
was
okay.
talking.
I know you got a lot going on over there. That's all right. That's all right. Yes. Okay, so then shoulder extension. Somebody, Khalees, are you available?
Yes, I'm available.
Hi, Khalees. Can you tell me what's happening in the back using as many terms as possible? in the posterior deltoid?
It is extension.
Start. Yes, the shoulder is an extension.
Mhm. And
The fibers
it's
are what?
concentric. It's
Very
concentric
good. Very good. Concentric. How do you know it's concentric?
because they're shortening.
Very good, Khalees. But can you put a name on the actual muscle? Can you name the muscle that's concentrically shortening?
Oh, is it the
We moving
deltoid?
to, it is the deltoid. Are we moving towards the anterior or the posterior surface of the body when we extend our shoulder?
We're moving towards the posterior, towards the back.
So it's probably which deltoid? Anterior, lateral, or posterior deltoid?
Posterior deltoid.
Correct. Posterior deltoid is contracting concentrically. It's shortening. Another name for that muscle, or what's the name of that muscle? Agonist or antagonist?
Agonist.
And it's being antagonized by which muscle?
The antagonist.
The posterior
That is
deltoid.
very true, Khalees. No, it's not the posterior deltoid that's antagonizing. The posterior deltoid is being antagonized by which muscle, Khalees?
Interior.
The anterior.
The anterior deltoid. That's correct. And what's the nature of the contraction there?
That's concentric.
That is
It's not concentric.
concentric.
It
It's
is
not.
not concentric. No. You yourself said that the posterior deltoid was contracting concentrically, with the fibers shortening. The anterior deltoid is lengthening. What do we call it? What's that called, Khalees?
Oh, eccentric is when it's lengthening. Yeah.
Eccentric, that's right. Eccentric is when it's lengthening. That's right. Kim Sue gives you a second chance, but on the MBLEx, unfortunately, you can only answer the question one time. Did you know that?
Mhm.
You can't go
Oh
back.
yeah. Yeah.
Ridiculous. So you got to write this stuff down when you're doing it. You just write down like, okay, posterior over here on your sheet of paper. Do they give you a sheet of paper to make notes?
They do.
Good. So you write down on one side, posterior delt, anterior delt, extension, posterior delt, anterior delt, shortening, lengthening, concentric, eccentric, prime mover, agonist, antagonist. You write it down like that so you cannot mix it up. How many times have you heard me mix those terms up today alone, right? We all mix them up. So you have to write them down, make sure that you know them. Okay. Okay, now we're gonna do a trigger one. By the way, I made a video on this. I think I sent the link to you guys as well as the other classes on all these things, just drilling front, back, short, long, concentric, eccentric, agonist, antagonist, etc. Okay, so you can see that on YouTube. Share it with people if you find it useful. Okay, now external rotation, internal rotation. Right, you look at the arm bone, look at the humerus. The humerus is spinning outward. The humerus is spinning out. Humerus is spinning outward. Right, and now the humerus is spinning inward. See, the humerus is spinning inward now, toward the midline. Now it's spinning outward, away from the midline. This is called external rotation, also called movement away from the midline is also called what? Medial or lateral?
Lateral.
Lateral. And this is called internal rotation. Movement toward the midline is also called what? Medial or lateral?
Medial.
Medial.
Very good, very good. So medial rotation, lateral rotation, move with me, internal rotation, external rotation. External rotation is accomplished by the infraspinatus muscle, on the posterior surface of the scapula. On the anterior surface of the scapula is the subscapularis muscle that does internal rotation. So with external rotation, which muscle is the agonist? With external rotation, which muscle is the agonist? The infraspinatus or the subscapularis?
The
One more time,
infraspinatus.
please. The infraspinatus, yes. And with internal rotation, which one is the agonist? The subscapularis or the... Very good, very good. Okay, now someone else. So with external or lateral rotation, which muscle is shortening concentrically? The infraspinatus or the subscap? I heard someone say infraspinatus. Good. And what's the nature of the contraction for the subscapularis? Lengthening or shortening? Eccentric. Lengthening or shortening? Lengthening. Agonist or antagonist?
Antagonist.
Antagonist. Very good. Pectoralis major versus rhomboids and middle traps. Okay, let's just say rhomboids for short and pectoralis major. So with shoulder blade protraction, what is the nature of the contraction in the rhomboids? Eccentric or concentric?
Eccentric.
Very good. Eccentric. Are the fibers lengthening or shortening?
Lengthening.
Lengthening.
Very good. And what's happening with shoulder blade protraction or with the push-up phase of a push-up? What's happening with the pectoralis major muscle?
Shortening.
Yeah,
Concentric.
and what's that? Concentric. And what is that muscle called then?
Pectoralis. Pectoralis.
Yes, agonist or antagonist?
Agonist.
Agonist.
Agonist. And then the title for the rhomboids would be what?
Antagonist.
Antagonist. Good. Which one is the prime mover?
Agonist.
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 Yes. Yes. Is the antagonist ever the prime mover?
No.
No.
No. Okay. I have my arms up in what?
Extension.
Really?
Oh, sorry. Flexion.
I guess we're in bizarro world all of a sudden. So I have my
Sorry.
arms up in. Flexion, shoulder flexion. Shoulder flexion. I want to do an antagonist. I want my pectoralis major muscle to antagonize the rhomboids. Which way would I move? Describe the movement. Start with the movement. Protraction, retraction, elevation, depression. I want these to be the antagonists. Which way do I move my shoulder blades?
Back. No.
Down.
Okay, retraction, protraction, elevation, or depression?
Retraction.
Retraction, that's correct. Very good. And which muscle am I contracting concentrically to retract?
Pectoralis.
To retract the shoulder blades, which muscle am I contracting concentrically?
The rhomboids.
The rhomboids, very good. Okay, so I want you to practice saying, all right, contract your rhomboids concentrically to retract your scapula, or protract your scapula to contract your pectoralis concentrically. Okay, so practice that kind of thing. And then I think you guys get the point. One more, hip flexors versus glutes. Now, with the hip flexor, there are two muscles that act as the hip flexor. There's the iliocostalis, which is actually formed of two other muscles, the iliacus and the psoas muscle. So there's the iliocostalis, and then there's the rectus femoris. Actually, all the quads flex the. Is that true? No, the rectus femoris is I think the only one that attaches to the ilium. So it's the only one that can actually move the femur like this. The rest extend the knee, I believe. So we have what's collectively called the hip flexor group, muscles from above and from below that flex the hip, right? So again, think front back, shortening versus lengthening, all right? So if I'm kicking a ball in front of me with the left leg, which side, front or back, is shortening?
Back is shortening. Front.
The front is shortening. The front is shortening. Correct. If I'm bending over to pick something up, which side is shortening? The front or the back?
The front.
The front. The front is shortening in both of them. And what's the name of this angle for the hip? Flexion or extension?
Flexion.
Flexion.
Flexion. That's correct. So in hip flexion, there's always shortening in the front and what in the back?
Extension in the back.
Lengthening in the back. This is extension.
lengthening.
This is lengthening. Yes. Okay. And if the hip flexors are shortening in the front, what's the nature of the contraction there?
Concentric.
Concentric contraction, shortening in the front. They're also called the what?
Prime mover. Agonist.
Another name for the prime mover is the agonist. Describe the
Agonist.
contraction and describe the contraction and the designation in the back. Concentric or eccentric, antagonist or agonist.
Eccentric and the antagonist.
Good. And which muscle is the eccentric antagonist in the back?
The glute.
The glute. So if you were to say, if the question were which muscle antagonizes the hip flexor, what would you say?
The quads.
Which muscle antagonizes? Antagonizes, so the opposite.
Glute.
The glute, that's correct. Which muscle antagonizes the glute? The hip flexor. What does the hip flexor do? Flexion or extension?
Flexion.
Flexion. So which one? So the antagonistic movement would be extension. So which muscle does extension? The glute or the hip flexor?
The hip flexor.
The hip flexor.
Extension. Which one does extension?
Glute.
The glute. That's right. That's right. This is also hip extension. Can you see that the glute is also contracting, shortening, and the hip flexor is also lengthening?
Yes.
And if I take 1 foot up off the floor, you have the same movement, shortening here in the glute and lengthening in the hip flexor. Okay, let's move on. So the knee. So now we have the soleus gastroc in the back and the tibialis anterior in the front. Okay, so if I am flexing my knee, is the gastroc shortening or lengthening? Shortening, that's right, which makes the contraction what?
Concentric.
Concentric, that's correct. But that's only for the upper fibers of the gastroc. For the lower fibers, they act on the ankle. So if I'm plantar flexing, is the gastroc and soleus, are they shortening or lengthening?
Shortening.
Yes, yes. And the fibers and which fibers are lengthening?
Tibialis anterior.
Tibialis anterior. Very good. So describe the nature of the contraction in the soleus and gastroc.
Concentric. The agonist.
Yes. Concentric agonist, and they're shortening. Yes. And they're also called the prime
Mover.
Very good. And the tibialis anterior, the nature of the contraction there?
Interesting. Agonist.
Eccentric antagonist. And last one for today, dorsiflexion. Which muscle is the agonist? Which is the antagonist?
So I think the agonist is the back.
Look at the one that is shortening. Which surface is shortening, the front or the back?
The front.
The front. Which muscle is in the front? The soleus or the tibialis anterior?
Tibialis anterior.
Correct. So what's the nature of the contraction in the tibialis anterior?
Concentric.
Concentric contraction, also called
Agonist.
the agonist, also called the
Prime mover.
prime mover. Great, good. Okay. I'd like to spend a few more minutes, for anyone who can hang out, a few minutes going over some other stuff. If you like the circulatory system, maybe if you want to hang out for a few more minutes and check it out, great. If not, we'll cover it next time. All right. We'll review it next time. By the way, any questions about agonist, antagonist, concentric, eccentric?
I feel like that is becoming a lot more clear to me.
Great, good.
So awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's pretty remarkable what happens when you like touch your body and go, okay, anterior delt flexion, and you start moving, right? Kinesthetic learning is very powerful.
Hearing you speak and then watching you do the movements and then even, feeling on your own body, it's like, that's what I needed.
Yeah.
Instead of me trying to sit down and put all this in my head myself. And so, I'm
Yeah, good. Yeah, because it uses different areas of your brain, one for hearing, one for touching, one for moving. And then your brain has to mix all that through another area, the association area. So the learning is a lot more deep, like when you tell the kid not to get the candy out of the drawer and they figure out if they go through the back door rather than the front door, it's just a different path, right? And now they've got 2 ways.
And I feel like
sneaking the
more is
candy.
coming together also with
Yeah.
this and memorizing muscles better.
Yeah, like learning the muscles is clearer. Yeah, we'll go over like some twisting stuff next time, and that's going to be a little bit more challenging, because then we introduce which side of the body is agonist and which side is antagonist. But and they're not going to drill you on like all that stuff, but it'll be useful to have some of it in place, and that'll help you to learn some of the other muscles. So I think that's good for the muscle stuff. Okay, so for the circulatory system, we have not done the circulatory system yet. If you can just remember, where's my share? I need to share my screen. Here we go. If you can just remember aorta, artery, arterial, capillary, veinule, vein, vena cava. If you can just remember that, it will help you so much. So that is the flow of blood, and it's like pretty simple actually, meaning that the nature of the words themselves actually describe, there's an aorta and there's a vena cava, right? So those two go together. There's an artery and there's a vein. Those two go together. There's an arterial and there's a venule. Those two really go together, right? They really sound like each other, arterial and venule. And then there's capillaries. The capillaries, you have arteries that are capillaries, like so blood is moving away from the heart toward the end, the terminal end, which is the capillary. And you have veins that are capillaries, so the blood is moving away from the capillaries and towards the heart. So the arteries are bringing blood this way. Artery capillaries are bringing blood this way. The vein capillaries are bringing blood this way. So maybe I'll just capillary show you guys. Yeah, so here's like a broad breakdown without all those terms, where they just have artery, capillary, and vein. So you have the artery taking the blood this way, and then it thins out to the point where it's called a capillary. And then it starts to take the blood at the capillary, the blood is exchanged from artery to vein, and it brings the blood back into the vein, which returns to the heart. So, and then if we put the whole thing in, let's see, let's go back to the basics document. If you click on it, it brings up a more expanded view. That actual view is not that useful now that I'm looking at it. I apologize. So let's try this. Oh, here we go. Very nice. So here you see a finer breakdown. And you can see that the aorta becomes a smaller artery, arteries become smaller arterioles, arterioles become capillaries. And there are capillaries being contributed from the artery side and capillaries being contributed from the vein side. Venules, the smallest after capillaries, they start as venules, then they increase and they're called veins, and then they increase and they're called vena cava. So it's not that complicated, but I found that the easiest way to memorize it is just going through this sequence right here: aorta, artery, arterial, capillary, venule, vein, vena cava. So let's do that 3 times. You guys stay on mute, but repeat after me: aorta, artery, arterial, capillary, venule, vein, vena cava. Again, artery. Oh, shucks. All right, second time's a charm. Here we go. So second time: aorta, artery, arterial, capillary, venule, vein, vena cava. Third time: aorta, artery, arterial, capillary, venule, vein, vena cava. All right, and then if we look at the presentation for circulation, you will find that I'll find that for you in just a moment. Let's see. I believe that's currently in body systems. It should be named as kinesio circulatory. but right now it's under, or maybe anatomy circulatory, but right now it's just under cardiovascular circulatory. All right. Either way, if you wanted to learn about the heart and the flow of the blood, you would look for cardiovascular and circulatory. Right. And so your study point, which you're responsible for, is to understand the various ways massage might affect circulation, understand the different blood vessels like arteries and capillaries and the functions of those blood vessels, and then understand the larger structures of the heart, and as a result, the flow of the blood in the heart. And then from there, we get into smaller stuff we're not going to get into today, like the basic components of the blood, like what are the 5 things the blood is made up of, and what does each one of them do? So we'll come back to like what massage does, and then we just covered this a minute ago. So now, and we'll do that in more detail next time. So now we come to the slides where you're supposed to comprehend or understand what occurs in the larger structures of the heart, like the valves and the different heart chambers. And there's a couple slides here with these drawings or with these graphics. But if you go to your basics document, if you go to your MBLEx basics document, you'll find these exact images a little bit further down. And the nice thing about this document compared to this slides presentation is that the document allows you to zoom in much more so than the slides presentation. So we're going to use this one. So this is the last thing that we'll practice today. Again, just a lot of repetition. So it's bringing, it's memorizing the flow of blood on the right and the left, and also where's the oxygenated versus the deoxygenated blood. All right, so repeat after me. You can, let's have some fun. Let's make a mess. Unmute and repeat after me. Deoxygenated blood comes in through the superior and inferior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood
Deoxygenated
comes in
blood
through the superior and inferior vena cava.
comes
Comes
in
in
through the
superior
superior and
and inferior
inferior
cava.
vena cava.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think each one of you got vena cava. Nice. Very nice. Okay. From the superior inferior vena cava into the right atrium. From the superior inferior vena cava
From
From
the
the
superior
superior
inferior
inferior
vena cava
vena cava
into the right atrium.
into the right atrium.
into the right atrium.
From the right atrium into the right ventricle.
From the right
the right
atrium
atrium
into
to the
the
right
right ventricle.
Through the tricuspid valve.
Through the
Through the
tricuspid.
tricuspid valve.
Yes. Right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle. Right
Right
atrium,
atrium,
tricuspid valve,
Tricuspid
Right.
right
Right
ventricle.
right ventricle.
Yes. Atrium letter A goes on top, ventricle letter V goes on the bottom. So A like an atrium sometimes in like public spaces like malls or some public buildings, you have an atrium, which is like a big glass, very cool looking, big glass looking ceiling. And ventricle letter V like a valley. So you have atrium on top, valley or ventricle on the bottom, right? So right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle. Go ahead, right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle.
Right atrium, tricuspid
Right
valve,
atrium,
right ventricle.
tricuspid valve, right ventricle.
Good. Right ventricle into the pulmonary artery.
Right ventricle into the pulmonary artery.
Through the pulmonary valve.
Through the pulmonary.
Pulmonary valve.
Yes, right ventricle, pulmonary valve, pulmonary artery. Right
Right
ventricle,
Right
ventricle.
ventricle,
pulmonary valve, pulmonary
Artery.
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 Pulmonary artery into the lungs.
Pulmonary
Pulmonary
artery.
artery into the lung,
From the lungs into the pulmonary veins.
From the lungs
lungs
into
into the pulmonary veins,
Pulmonary veins to the left atrium.
Pulmonary.
pulmonary veins to the left atrium,
Very good. Left atrium to left ventricle.
left atrium,
Yeah.
left
to
ventricle,
left ventricle.
Through the bicuspid mitral valve. Be my Valentine. BMV. Be my
Through the
Valentine. Through the
By
bicuspid mitral valve.
mitral valve,
Cuspid mitral valve.
Be my Valentine.
Mitral valve.
Be my Valentine.
Be my Valentine.
Bicuspid mitral valve.
I'm so touched. I'm so touched. Okay, now from the left ventricle into the aorta.
The left
Left
ventricle.
ventricle into the aorta.
Guess what the
Aortic
name of that
valve.
valve is going to be? The
Aortic
aortic valve.
The valve.
Very good. From the aorta to the top and the bottom of the body, superior and inferior parts of the body.
From the aorta to the top and bottom. Sorry.
Very good. Okay. Deoxygenated blood, superior, inferior vena cava.
Deoxygenated blood, superior vena cava.
cava.
Into the right atrium.
Into the
Into the
right
right
atrium.
atrium.
Right atrium, tricuspid valve, try to be right.
Right
Right
atrium.
atrium to
Tricuspid valve.
tricuspid valve.
Try to be right. Into the right ventricle.
Oh. Into the right
Into
ventricle.
the, yes. Right atrium, tricuspid valve, try to be right into the right ventricle. Right atrium.
So much.
Right atrium.
What?
Right atrium.
Right atrium through the
Tricuspid valve, try to be right
Try to be right to the right
into the right ventricle. Yeah. Right ventricle into the pulmonary artery through the pulmonary valve.
Right
Right
ventricle
ventricle into the pulmonary artery.
valve.
To the pulmonary valve.
Through the pulmonary valve. Very good. Pulmonary artery into the pulma or lung. Pulmonary artery into the pulma or lung.
or lung.
Pulmonary artery.
Into the pulmonary
pulmonary.
lung.
Or lung.
Yes. From the pulma or lung into the pulmonary vein. From the pulma or lung into the pulmonary vein.
From the pulma or lung into the pulmonary vein.
Very good. Pulmonary vein to the left atrium.
Pulmonary vein to the left atrium.
atrium.
Yes. Left atrium into the left ventricle.
Left atrium.
Left atrium into left ventricle.
ventricle.
Through the bicuspid mitral valve, be my Valentine.
Through the back
The
of the
bicuspid
valve.
Cuspid mitral valve. Be my Valentine.
Be my Valentine.
Be my Valentine.
Very good. From the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the aorta.
From the left ventricle
Valve
into the aortic valve.
Into the aorta through the aortic valve.
into the aorta through the aortic valve.
Very good. Very good. What side is the tricuspid valve on? Is it try to be right or is it be my Valentine?
Try to be right.
Try to be right.
That's right. And which side is the bicuspid mitral valve on? Is it on the left or the right?
The left.
That's correct. And what's another name for the mitral valve? Be my Valentine. What's a name for the mitral valve?
Bicuspid mitral.
The bicuspid valve. Very good. What's the pulmonary artery valve named after? The valve that separates the ventricle from the pulmonary artery. What's it named after?
The lungs.
The lungs, or it's named after the vessel that it goes to, the pulmonary artery.
You don't let it go.
So pulmonary valve. And what's the valve that separates the left ventricle from the aorta? What's that named after?
The left atrium.
It's named after the blood vessel, the aorta. So it's the aortic valve. So you have the four chambers of the heart: the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium. And then you have the four valves. You have the try to be right tricuspid valve, the pulmonary valve, the bicuspid mitral valve, be my Valentine. And then you have the aortic valve. Not so mysterious, right? Oh God, nobody's responding. Okay. Okay. Patient is unresponsive. All right. So one more time, just a little bit cleaner now. Superior, inferior vena cava into the right atrium.
Superior.
Inferior vena cava into the right atrium.
Right atrium.
Very good. Right atrium, try to be right, tricuspid valve.
Right atrium, try to be right, tricuspid valve to the right.
Right ventricle. Very good. Okay, everybody else. Right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle.
Right atrium,
Right atrium.
tricuspid valve,
Right cusp.
right ventricle.
Correct. Right ventricle, pulmonary artery through the pulmonary valve.
Right ventricle.
Right
pulmonary
ventricle, pulmonary
valve.
valve, pulmonary artery.
Through the pulmonary valve.
Pulmonary valve.
Pulmonary valve.
Thank you. Thank you. Into the lungs,
Into the lungs.
To the lungs.
from the pulma or lungs into the pulmonary vein. From the pulma or lungs into the pulmonary vein.
From the
The
pulmonary
pulma-
lungs into the pulmonary vein.
Pulmonary vein.
Pulmonary vein to the left atrium to the left ventricle.
Pulmonary vein to the left atrium.
To the left ventricle.
Very good. Be my Valentine bicuspid mitral valve.
Be my
Valentine. Mitral valve.
Bicuspid mitral valve.
Mitral valve.
Left ventricle aortic valve aorta.
Left
Left ventricle
Aortic
aortic valve.
Left
Very
ventricle
good.
valve aorta.
Yes. Very good. Very good, guys. Okay, that's enough for today. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Practice a little bit today, but rest so that your brain can integrate. All right. Good job, guys.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
You're welcome. We'll see you tomorrow. All right. Have a good day. Bye-bye.